The revolution is here. A movement of people free to live, work, and choose. We won't tell you what to think. We just demand that you think for yourself. This is Kibbe on Liberty. Okay, we're almost like in Joe Rogan territory because we're going into a second hour, but I wanted to talk about something fundamentally different because you have been one of the leading economic historians critical of the 1619 project and Nicole Hannah
Jones. Yeah.
Thank you. And I've done very little on this subject, and I'm not particularly schooled in critical race theory, but it's becoming something that I think my audience would love to learn more about, and you've been in the trenches on this for a long time.
That is.
Yeah. I remember you shared on your Facebook page a presentation you gave at George Mason University quite some time ago.
Yep.
Talking about how critical race theory had sort of hijacked the intellectual integrity of the university system.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's how you would say it, but
I think it's a fair summary of it. So yeah, this is a subject I've been working on for far longer than the 1619 project. So that came out in August 2019. But what I had noticed before that is there was a turn, almost an ideological turn among university faculty, whereas maybe 20 or 30 years ago, people that would identify on the left, they were kind of old guard liberal left, what used to be the ACLU types, people that valued free speech and free inquiry and civil rights and civil liberties, and would guard those even if they disagreed with the person that was exercising them from the other side. And that's been largely displaced and supplanted by people that adhere to what we call critical theory ideology. And it's a whole class of different ways of looking at the world. So there's critical race theory, critical gender theory. There's even like a critical vegan studies, I think, was one of the subfields that they're trying to develop. But this is a much more aggressive version of left-wing ideology that almost embraces as a value that anything on the other side is evil and should be discriminated against and should be written out of the conversation, should be essentially canceled.
So it's been many years since I've read the postmodern philosophers, but I have drawn some sort of line in my head between some of the basic insights of postmodernism, and particularly like Hans Georg Gadamer and hermeneutics and stuff like that had a certain humility of trying to figure out what people meant when they said certain words,
right.
and suggesting that words have context and it's not simple and objective the way that we might think about it, versus critical theory, which says nothing's true and it is what I say it is.
Or it's nothing's true except for our ideological beliefs that we've imported as priors into the system. That's the critical theory approach. And I think this really comes to the roots of critical theory as an offshoot of Marxism. So in the 1930s, there's a group of Western Marxists, so they're outside of the Soviet Union sphere, but they're adherents of this system of thought, this ideology, grows up around the University of Frankfurt. And what they do is they try to parse the history of philosophy into two sets of theories. There's a traditional theory, which is descriptive. It often poses as empiricism in their version of it. But they say traditional theory upholds the ruling class, upholds the people in power. Critical theory, they claim, is emancipatory, and they mean emancipatory as in liberating the proletariat, liberating the oppressed class, overthrowing the traditional theory. And it's really, what it does is it infuses the way that this approach to philosophy even asks questions. It's not, are we trying to describe the world as it is? It's, what are we trying to do to change the world? And conveniently, they have this bearded German guy named Karl Marx that has all the answers ready for them that they've just embraced as like it's a scientific truth that the world is bending toward. And their goal as academics is to basically engage in scholarship that promotes this so-called truth that they've embraced already from Marxism.
But it's political in the sense
Absolutely.
that there's good guys and bad guys, so it's not one set of rules applied to everybody equally at all.
Right. It's we can engage on our side if we're a critical theorist because we've already made the decision to seek an emancipatory goal, to seek a liberationist goal, and done so through our scholarship, through political means, through activist approaches to whatever question we happen to be studying. They treat that as that gives them basically a moral superiority over people that are upholding traditional theory. Traditional theory is said to be descriptive in the way it presents itself, but is really seen as like it's almost like a conspiracy theory approach that they take to it. They say that traditional theory is really just upholding the ruling class, upholding old power hierarchies, and because of that, it is morally unworthy of even being given a level playing field of consideration.
So I sort of somewhat comically ran into this for the first time, I want to say around 2012. I ended up on CNN debating Don Lemon about whether or not the Tea Party was racist.
Right.
And I foolishly accepted that gig, which was perhaps me being young and naive. But he got on me for using the phrase colorblind society.
Yeah.
By which I mean the rules of the land should be treat everybody the same regardless of the color of your skin. And I went on to, without citing Martin Luther King, I went on to quote standard Martin Luther King.
Sure.
And he was pushing back.
Yeah.
It was shocking to me that the idea that we would judge people based on the content of their character was no longer accepted universally from, at the time, Don Lemon wasn't as big as he is now, but
Sure.
I'm like, wow, I'm shocked that you don't believe the same thing I do on this.
Yeah. There's an explicit repudiation. This comes from the critical race theory, which is critical theory methodology applied to race, of the notion of a colorblind society. The claim here is that a colorblind society is put forth as a philosophical premise by the traditional theorists to prop up those who are already in power. Therefore, we need to overturn this. So it's actually an expression of a repudiation of liberalism, classical liberalism. You know, a Hayekian concept of a generality norm is that there's a universal rule for all of society. Maybe it's a rule for constraining government. It's a constitutional rule of non-discrimination. But what they're saying is basically an epistemological approach that adopts the standpoint as the basis of truth rather than trying to find a universal that works for all of human society. So yeah, they see colorblindness as directly hostile to critical theory and something that they repudiate, and when they repudiate it, they automatically brand it as racist.
Yeah. So you were well positioned when the New York Times announced the 1619 Project, and I guess the first thing was an essay, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But talk a little bit about your research before that, because it gets interesting, particularly in the context of Abraham Lincoln.
That is especially interesting in the context of Abraham Lincoln. So, economic historian, one of the core areas that I've always done research on, wrote an entire dissertation on, is 19th century American economic policy, which is very closely intertwined with slavery. So I've worked on slavery for decades. My first academic publications were on basically the political economy of slavery. This is stuff that I was working on as an undergraduate. I wrote a senior thesis on the Civil War era, the breakdown of the Union over the slavery question. And this is something I probably published, I think, in excess of 24 scholarly articles, book chapters, books on. The one area that I really focused in on, and was the subject of my first book, was this weird idea from the 19th century that as slavery was ended in the United States through emancipation, abolition, manumission, whatever you want to take as your approach, several people in the 19th century said, well, what do we do with African Americans after they are freed? And one of the so-called solutions was to induce them to move abroad. This is how Liberia is founded as a country, so that's the most famous example. But by the Civil War, they're also considering the Caribbean, Central and South America. The idea is that we free the slaves, but we also relocate the former slaves to other countries, other parts of the world. And there's all sorts of motives for this that are rooted in at least an anti-slavery sentiment, but it's also a sentiment that believes that there's going to be race problems in the United States afterward if we have a large black population living as free citizens among a white majority country. So it's kind of this paternalistic, somewhat racist 19th century way of looking at things. But I had done several of the major academic works.
It's pre-progressive before progressivism emerges.
It is. It is. And I wrote an entire book on Abraham Lincoln's connections to the colonization movement. It's probably the first book-length treatment of this specific subject. I've written dozens of academic articles. I wrote the main encyclopedia article for one of the core Civil War encyclopedia texts on the colonization movement. So this was my bread and butter. This is my research area. So I come at the 1619 Project as someone who's not only working in this field, not only working as a commentator in this field, but someone who has done original scholarship going back several decades, 2 decades of work in dozens of articles on the exact subjects that the 1619 Project happened to be writing about.
So, and you're the basic punchline of your Lincoln research was that he was pro-colonization, probably until the day he died.
Probably until the day he died, and we have pretty clear evidence of this. There was a general, Benjamin F. Butler, who met with him at the White House, as far as we can tell, about 3 or 4 days before he was assassinated. And Butler, later in life, writes a memoir. He says, talks about the last time I met President Lincoln before he went to Ford's Theater. And he says, yes, he called me in, and he said, the Civil War's coming to an end. They had just won the war. General Lee had surrendered. And he says, General Butler, what do we do next? I have an idea I want to propose to you, and this idea is we take the freed slaves, we recruit the free slaves voluntarily, and we colonize them down in Panama and use them to dig a canal. We put them to work digging a canal, and this will be America's sphere of influence. It's our way of, commercially taking control of the hemisphere, but the whole idea is that this is work that we can provide to the freed slaves, and it solves the problem, the racial problem that is likely to follow in the South. So there's pretty clear evidence that Lincoln believed this until the day he died.
Yeah, and this is like we've had this debate just down the street from my house. There is a statue of Abraham Lincoln, and I think it's Logan. What is it called? Is it Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves?
Oh, it's the Emancipation Park.
It's in Lincoln Park.
Yeah.
And the BLM activists wanted to tear it down.
Yeah.
And I, my only beef with tearing down statues is this idea that you would try to erase history that you don't like.
Right.
And it would be more honest to look at Lincoln, good Lincoln, bad Lincoln,
Absolutely.
Flawed Lincoln, Lincoln in the context of his era, Lincoln in the context of the politics of his era. And when they were debating, I was trying to figure out, I'm not like a huge Lincoln apologist by any means, because he did all sorts of interesting things that libertarians would be offended by, but ultimately settled on Frederick Douglass's speech from that day.
Yeah, when they dedicate the statue.
And he talks about all of Lincoln's flaws.
Absolutely.
And this gets to the whole problem with the 1619 Project. It's a worthy conversation to have.
Yeah.
We should be honest and brutally honest about our own history with slavery, but we can't just make it up.
Right.
And this was kind of when you weighed in, you said it more elegantly than this, but like, guys, you're just making that up.
That's essentially what happened. And I distinctly remember the morning the 1619 Project came out in print. So they put it was August 2019. They put a big fancy print issue of the New York Times, and I pulled it up on my computer screen that morning. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. They've launched a new project to look at the historical legacy of slavery. Here I am as an economic historian that works very heavily in this area, of course I'm going to be interested. And I thought initially it was going to be a successor to an earlier project the Times had done. So between 2011 and 2015, they ran a series called Disunion that commemorated the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. And it had hundreds of scholars contributed to it. It was looking at the legacy of the Civil War. Slavery is obviously a very prominent part of that. I actually wrote several pieces for it, but so did hundreds of other historians, scholars that work in that era. And I thought, okay, well, the New York Times is doing a successor project. Then I start to read it, and I find immediately, just off the bat, there are two themes that stand out to me. One is it's very explicitly ideological. This was not historical analysis. It was more geared to, say, a 2020 political election than it was to looking at the past. And then the second feature of it is that they asked all sorts of authors to contribute to it that were not really experts in the subject matters that they were writing about, and they made basic fundamental factual errors that were all in the service of these political themes they're trying to prop up.
You know, I had forgotten until today when I was reviewing some of this that this was in the context of Trump's reelection, and it, from your telling, was basically a political project.
Yes, it's a campaign piece.
Yeah, but a couple of the themes that are relevant to those of us that believe in freedom and the market process and all of that was that the basic argument is that capitalism, free market American style, constitutional capitalism. I don't like to use the C word because I think it's misleading, but let's just use it because they're using it, that it doesn't work without the slave economy.
Right. So this is the thing that jumps out. I didn't focus immediately on the Nicole Hannah-Jones essay, which is the lead essay. It's the one that's been the source of most of the controversy. It's actually the second essay in the 1619 project that really caught my attention early on. And this is by a sociologist from Princeton University by the name of Matthew Desmond. And it's the title of the essay is basically Capitalism and Slavery. And what Desmond did is he basically makes an argument that American capitalism, and by that he means a stand-in for free market, laissez-faire theory, low taxes, low regulation, everything that we as economic free market liberals believe in. He says it's infused with the brutality of the slave system. And to make this argument, because he's very clearly trying to discredit capitalism today, and he says this in the piece, he wants things like socialized medicine and higher taxes and wealth redistribution, all the standard fare progressive left policy agenda. But his way of arguing for that is not considering those policies and their merits. It's saying that capitalism itself is tainted from the origin in the United States by being wedded at the hip to slavery. And he even goes so far, at one of the opening lines of this essay, he declares that if you are using a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet in the year 2019 when he's writing, this traces back to the plantation accounting books. And he declares this as like, that's supposed to discredit Microsoft Excel.
Yeah.
So I'm reading this and I'm scratching my head and say, this is an odd claim. So I go to the book that he cites for this claim. It's a book by Caitlin Rosenthal called Accounting for Slavery, which is, as the title suggests, it's about the accounting practices on the plantations. And it turns out Desmond has actually misread her opening chapter. She says, I'm not writing an origin story of accounting today. I'm not claiming that Microsoft Excel is the successor to the plantation accounting books. So she announces right from the outset of her book that she wants to dispel this notion. He misread it and he inverted the claim and says Microsoft Excel derives from plantation slavery. Therefore, this is a proof that slavery taints everything.
So I've had conversations, not on this show, but other things that we've done at Free the People with some of my progressive friends, one of whom introduced me to this concept that work is really a form of slavery.
Right.
Wage.
Right.
They have a phrase for it that I didn't even understand the context of what it meant, but since I've heard like AOC talk about the fact that there are certain jobs that are essentially slavery.
Yeah, wage slavery or it's exploitation. And there's
And it's again a bizarre new concept. And if Walter Williams was alive, he would be raging raging against, because of course working for yourself is how you get independence and liberate. But this is part of this ideology.
It absolutely is, and it's an unwitting part of this ideology. It actually has its precursors not in the historical left per se, is not in the Marxian left that they all draw on, although they do adhere to that ideology. These are arguments that are basically recycled almost unintentionally from the pro-slavery theorists of the mid-19th century. So one of the guys that I get into in my critique, there was a theorist from Virginia by the name of George Fitzhugh, and he wrote in the 1850s. He's seen as one of the premier pro-slavery guy that's arguing against people like Frederick Douglass. He actually goes to the North a couple times and debates abolitionists, presenting the pro-slavery case, and they're trying to tear him down for those reasons. But Fitzhugh, the core of his thesis is an assault not just on abolitionism, it's an assault on the notion of free labor. So he declares that the laborers of the North are basically wage slaves of the capitalists. This guy is a classical anti-capitalist. He even develops arguments. He writes about a decade before Marx pens Capital. But he develops arguments that directly anticipate Marx's line of argument in Capital. He says that the owners of capital are appropriating from their workers the surplus value of their production. And this is all from the wage labor system. The weird twist on Fitzhugh, he says, well, the solution to all of this is we eliminate the capital owner-labor relationship, the bourgeois-proletariat relationship in the Marxian terms, by simply owning the workers. We need to have like a medieval feudal-style lord of the plantation manor that owns everyone else and provides order and direction and care and well-being. It houses them, it clothes them, it feeds them. It solves what he says are the exploitative problems of capitalism.
So the Lincoln story is interesting to me, and your work on that is a little bit comical because Nicole Hannah-Jones had actually cited your work positively, sort of puncturing some holes in this mythology about Lincoln as sort of savior who had no flaws, and of course that's not true. But then she discovered you wrote it.
Right. So this is a great story. So one of the first things the 1619 Project comes under fire on, I had been focusing on the economics, but other historians focus on Nicole Hannah-Jones's essay. And it's a sweeping kind of summary essay of American history trying to recontextualize everything around the history of slavery. So, of course, she's digging into the American Revolution, she's digging into the Civil War, and one of the issues she raises is the fact that Lincoln was a colonizationist, a supporter of colonization. And there was an older school in the history profession that I had directly challenged a decade ago when I started working on this, that tried to discount his colonizationism. They tried to claim, well, this is just a political ploy in the service of greater goals of emancipation. He wasn't really serious about it. They tried to do kind of like the Anthony Fauci thing. It's like they claim that Lincoln told the lie that he was in favor of colonization just to lead the public over to his side of emancipation.
Yeah.
So that was really popular in there. And what I did in my work is I actually found private correspondence, private diplomatic records that contradicted this whole story. It showed that Lincoln was, in fact, very serious about colonization. He signed agreements privately with the British government and with governments of other Caribbean colonies, Caribbean holdings, to prepare for the colonization of the slaves after the Civil War. So it really kind of just explodes this whole mythology that had built up around that one area of Lincoln. And I'm not saying I'm an anti-Lincoln guy. I'm not a pro-Lincoln guy either. I'm kind of a middle-of-the-road scholar on this. I see the good things and the bad things that he did. But my work was focused on the fidelity to the historical evidence.
Yeah.
So 1619 Project actually draws on some of the colonization studies that I had worked on, and after it comes out in print, and Nicole Hannah-Jones is taking heat and flack from other historians that are saying, no, Lincoln wasn't a true colonizationist, she starts citing my book. by name, sending, like tweeting out the Amazon link and say, read this book, focus on this book because it shows that I am in fact right on Lincoln. She also found articles that I had written for the New York Times, her own employer, laying out my evidence on Lincoln and colonization 4 or 5 years before she wrote on this. So she tweets this out. She's citing it everywhere. I noticed a few of it. I actually had the sense to screen cap it because she deletes a lot of her tweets after the fact. But then somebody came along and pointed out to her, I think it was Alex Tabarrok from GMU, after she tweeted out a link to my book and says, you know who the author of that is? It's Phil Magness, the guy that wrote this devastating critique of the other parts, the economic parts of the 1619 Project. And then she goes completely silent. And a few weeks to a few months later, every time my name starts coming up again, she completely does an about face, like a 180, and starts attacking my credentials.
Yeah.
Drops any mention of my work on Lincoln and colonization. And then the most recent twist of this is the 1619 Project published a new expanded book-length edition. She went through and she revised all the sections that previously cited or previously referenced what Lincoln did on colonization and changed them. So now she adopts kind of this older line. And instead of citing anything to me, it goes to the secondhand account by Ibram X. Kendi, the critical race theory anti-racism activist that he had written about Lincoln several years ago. That's not really a scholarly work. It's more of a popular press type of a political account of this. So here you have the organizer, the chief editor of the 1619 Project, was originally relying on my research, my scholarship. She found out that I was a critical writer on other aspects of the 1619 Project, and as pure retribution for the fact that I had dared to criticize her, I had to be silenced and excised from the 1619 Project.
Well, because it's not a pursuit of historical knowledge; it's a political agenda that matters. And let's extrapolate out. But the bottom line, and this is true to the critical race theory framework, is that the system is designed for white people to benefit white people at the expense of everybody else. It's white privilege, so the Declaration and the Constitution and our whole system of law is fundamentally corrupt.
Right.
Not just law, but it's like
tainted by slavery, tainted by
the
racism.
capitalist system. And part of the 1619 Project, explicitly, I don't know from day one, you can tell me, but it was a curriculum.
Yes.
That
yes.
they were pushing to high schools.
Yeah. So hand in hand, the day that this comes out in the New York Times, the Pulitzer Center put together a high school curriculum that was built around the essays in the 1619 Project, and they launched it simultaneously. With the full knowledge of the New York Times, with Nicole Hannah-Jones promoting this thing. So it was intended all along to be adopted in the classrooms as an explicit part of what the Times was doing. They've, again, dumped untold millions of dollars into promoting this effort. I think they even bought a Super Bowl ad in 2021, the first Super Bowl after the 1619 Project came out. To promote it.
As a business model, like, are they selling the curriculum? Like, why would they spend that much money on this?
I think it's ideological more than anything. It doesn't seem to be that they're making a lot of money off of that specific angle of it, although I think they are getting money off of the book sales out of the
sure.
So
but not that kind of money.
Right.
Fascinating. And I bring that up because obviously we're now debating not only in Virginia but across the country whether or not critical race theory should be part of the curriculum. In
K through 12.
K-12, which these are government-run high schools. These are not. This is not a private public square, and hasn't she come back and said, no, we're not trying to get this into high schools?
Well, that's the oddity of it. The 1619 Project, it pivots between the different things that it wants to be. So when she wants to put it forth as scholarly history, she claims that she's writing history. When she comes under attack from historians that are pointing out that you're playing fast and loose with the facts, she says, oh, it's just journalism. This is metaphors. These are descriptive commentaries. It's not fully history. Well, they're doing the same thing with the curricular purposes of this. So even though they launched their own curriculum the day the 1619 Project appears in print, they've pivoted back and forth over whether they want this to be an educational tool for classroom adoption or not. So at the same time that Nicole Hannah-Jones and several of the other Times editors are railing against the criticism of critical race theory that's coming out of the political sphere, they're also pushing efforts to purchase copies of the 1619 Project book to donate to schools.
Yeah.
So there's a real mix of messages here, and they don't seem to really recognize the inconsistency between the two of them.
Or maybe they didn't think they would get caught.
Exactly.
Or maybe they didn't think it would be politically controversial. And that's sort of one of the upsides of, and you and I have talked on many other episodes about the horrible unintended consequences of lockdowns and,
Absolutely.
and all that. But perhaps one of the upsides particularly comes with education, because for all of the horrible things that the teachers' unions have done to children with masking and remote learning, one of the upsides perhaps is that a lot of parents for the first time saw some of the stuff that their kids were learning, and that's created this political backlash.
Yeah.
And I've seen like beautiful speeches from black parents at town hall meetings saying, you're teaching my kid that he can never succeed because inherently the system won't let him. And,
right.
and they're objecting first. They're like, this is bullshit.
Yeah, yeah. It's the effect of putting all of classroom teaching, classroom instruction online or over a Zoom link where the kid's sitting in front of a computer watching their teacher, and the parents are in the room sometimes, and they're seeing and hearing what is really substandard curriculum with a clear, explicit 2020 focused political message, even though it's masquerading as history. And you see this out of the 1619 Project. You see it out of other elements of the curriculum that had been built around infusing critical theory into K through 12 education. And this is a long-going movement. It's something that's not new to 2019, 2020 under the lockdowns. Really, it was the late 1960s. There was a critical theorist that operated out of the same kind of Marxian, revolutionary, emancipatory framework by the name of Paulo Freire, he writes a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it's this dense, like, overbearing Marxist tract about how pedagogy, classroom instruction itself, is in the service of the elite and needs to be overturned. It turns out this thing has become, over the 40 or so years since it was published, one of the most frequently assigned texts in schools of education, college schools of education. And it's diffused down into classroom instruction. And we start seeing some of the fruits of that in the adoption of these ideas as a way of looking at history. The critique I make of it is not so much that we don't want to ban all this stuff. I think it's really misguided to say we should ban certain ideas from the classroom, and I've opposed some of these bills that have come out of legislatures. But what I do say, and I think this holds up for the critical theory world in general, and particularly critical race theory, it's a very low rigor, flimsy form of scholarship that is just infused with heavy ideology and tends to be very light on facts, very light on evidence. So it's a bad way of looking at the past. It's a way of taking the past and turning it into a political weapon for the present. And that's really the critique that I would make of it. I think if you evaluate it on its merits against other ways of looking at the past, it loses every single time because it's just so flimsy.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know exactly what I think, but I think I might be more sympathetic to, quote, banning it, because banning is not banning is not banning when it comes to a government school curriculum is unfortunately always based on politics.
Yeah, well, expenditure of public resources, and I would support completely defunding it. I mean, I wouldn't support funding.
So we probably agree it's a semantics thing, because I do think that these are ideas worth debating, but it doesn't sound like they want to debate.
They don't. They want to declare themselves as true and right, and everyone else is racist or sexist or evil or is on the side of the oppressors, is on the side of traditional theory that's upholding the regime.
I've noticed these talking points again and again and again.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter what you're arguing with, but you're inevitably a white supremacist, a racist. And for the longest time, I didn't pay attention to this, but they've kind of radicalized me. Like when they called Joe Rogan a racist, I'm like, okay, you've sort of delegitimized the accusation. And by the way, when you do that, you give safe haven to real racists.
Right, right.
And that's sort of the nefarious. It
cheapens the term.
Yeah, it more than cheapens the term. It makes it irrelevant. So like we can't. It's hard to call out real racism, which is a real problem and something that we should all denounce. When everybody is a racist just based on the color of their skin.
Yeah, yeah. This goes back my own work before the 1619 Project was even a thing. I've worked very heavily in the history of public choice economics. And if you look back to the 1950s and 60s when public choice theory is coming into its own, there's a very prominent strain of that is anti-discriminatory. It comes from Gordon Tullock, and he analyzes the institution of slavery. Bill Hutt writes a book about South African apartheid as a feature of political capture of the South African government by racists and labor unions, white labor unions.
And Walter Williams wrote a book.
Absolutely.
A lot based on Hutt.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all in that same vein. So there's a very vibrant literature here that says we can diagnose institutionalized manifestations of racism. Gary Becker and Milton Friedman both work on this in the context of discrimination in the United States. So it's a very vibrant tradition. And it's actually empirically robust. If you look at the evidence, it lines up and it explains the story, which also gives us an answer how to fix it. How do we address segregation?
Yeah.
The problem with critical theory, and this comes straight out of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who's one of the founding fathers of critical race theory. So she wrote this horrific little book in 2019. It comes out, and it says, well, public choice theory is a manifestation of white supremacy and therefore should be discarded entirely. And her only citation to sustain this is Nancy MacLean's Democracy in Chains, this ridiculous, discredited conspiracy theory of a book that tries to brand public choice theory as like inherently segregationist.
Yeah, a hit job on my professor, James Buchanan.
Absolutely, yeah.
From back in the day. And I sat through his classes, and so I don't.
She learned agrarian poetry and John C. Calhoun secretly fed to you by all these.
It's ridiculous, but the accusation stands. Let's wrap it up there because I wanted to make sure that folks started thinking about this stuff. I'm sure my audience is way ahead of me on this, but give us a sense. Where can we get your book? What's your book called? And all the work you do at AIR.
Yeah, so the book is called A 1619 Project, A Critique, and it's available on Amazon and all the usual online booksellers. It is a collection of my essays basically dissecting the different chapters and components of the 1619 Project that have problems associated with them.
Cool. And broader AIR, as my viewers know, have been heroic on challenging lockdowns. Where do we find them?
Yeah, so AIER.org is where I publish most of my short pieces. So it's basically a repository of research on that, and I do all my commentaries on anything from the 1619 Project to historical economic policy, taxation, lockdowns, you name it.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that show, make sure that you like and subscribe. Click the little bell so that you get notifications. And if you consume this via podcast, go wherever you want to go. We're everywhere. Kibbe on Liberty. The revolution starts now.